Good evening and welcome back, everyone. I know it's been a while since there have been new shiurim posted on the channel online. Heard from some of you, I appreciate it. But I was taking some time to think and rethink the format of the shiurim, both in the Kolel and online. And I'd like to try recording more often from home, uploading more often from home, and perhaps separating between the shiurim and Kolel, which may be in one format, and shiurim recordings, content from home, that may be in a slightly different format. We shall see. I don't want to go off for too long on that, but I'm just addressing that up front. And let's get straight to some some material. Now, of course, we currently find ourselves in the midst of the 3 weeks. The Bein Hametzarim, book ended by Shiva Asar Tamuz at the beginning and Tisha B'Av at the end, the 2 fast days. And figure Bein Hametzarim is often the time when halachos of Bein Hametzarim come up for discussion. I know when I was much younger, I went out and bought 2 volumes of Nitei Gavriel. Those were the only 2 volumes of Nitei Gavriel that I owned on Bein Hametzarim. Bein Hametzarim have their own unique and interesting halachos, the 3 weeks generally, and more specifically the 9 days. And often there are questions, there's lack of clarity, or there's a bit of a gap between what the halacha says and how the halacha is practiced. And I guess you could say it was always a topic that I had a particular interest in, and at that time I wasn't aware of perhaps a monograph that was directly, uniquely on Bein Hametzarim. I saw the Nitei Gavriel, those 2 volumes for sale. I bought them. I think a few years later I came across Ovadia on Bein Hametzarim. I think that was the first volume of Ovadia on Mayadim, you could call it, that I bought. Later I obtained I don't know if I can say all the rest of the volumes, but a number of other volumes and other Yamim as well. That's all by way of introduction to say that let's discuss some of the halachos of Bein Hametzarim. So, first one I wanted to start with, and I think we'll be covering more than one here. The first one I'd like to start with is the halacha relating to clothing. Now, if you look at Shulchan Aruch, Siman Tov Kuf Nun Aleph, so first of all you'll notice that there really isn't a siman discussion concerning the halachos of Bein Hametzarim. Siman Tov Kuf Nun Aleph really concerns Shavua Shecholboi, or I guess you could say Lefi Minhag Ashkenaz, the 9 days. And those are really the halachos that are discussed. So, for example, in Sevav it says, Kelim Chodashim, Bein Levanim, Bein Tzvuim, Bein Shal Tzemer, Bein Shal Pishton, Aser Lilbish B'Shabazeh, by which he means the Shavua, Shecholboi, Tisha B'Av. And there's Haggah there, V'anu Machmir and Ashkenazim, Machmir, Rish Chodesh Ve'elach, the 9 days, right? This is the basic divide between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. The Ashkenazim have the 9 days, the Sephardim have the week of Tisha B'Av, without getting into all of that right now. But that's all the halachos of what we would call the 9 days. And that's really what the siman is about. The siman is called Dinei Shavua Shechal Tisha B'Av Lias B'Seicha. If you look throughout the siman, you'll see the Ramah comments here and there. Noig and lahachmir shein noisim yud zayin b'tamuz ve'elach. Noig and lahachmir with tispaidas, a haircut from yud zayin b'tamuz. But the siman is about the Shavua, the 9 days, until you get to the end. And you get to Sifta Zayin, the Mechaber, following the Torah, mentions Yesh Misanim yud zayin b'tamuz at Tisha B'Av. There were those who fasted from Shiva Asar b'tamuz already. All right, and then we get to Sif Yud Zayin, and Sif Yud Zayin says, the Mechaber says, Toiv li zoher miloymar Shehechiyanu Bein Hametzarim al pri oy al malbush, aval al pitin haben oimer, etc., etc. So the Mechaber is saying, it's good to avoid saying Shehechiyanu during Bein Hametzarim, so that's the 3 weeks, on a fruit or on clothing. Then Sif Yud Ches says, Tzorich li zoher mi Yud Zayin b'tamuz at Tes B'Av, not to walk alone from the 4th hour to the 9th hour. I think that's probably that ranks at the bottom of halachos of the 3 weeks that people know about and observe. We're not going to discuss that. And then the Mechaber adds, "V'lo yaku hatalmidim b'yom hahem." The rabbis, the teachers, shouldn't beat their students during these days. And we will also not delve into that right now. It is somewhat amusing, or perhaps to others very much not amusing, but it's sort of codified in the Shulchan Aruch in Sif Yud Ches that a whole year we beat the Talmidim. During the 3 weeks, we're careful not to beat the Talmidim. There's actually an Eshel Avram from the Bechacher who is Malamid Schos, that this halacha is not observed, and the Malamdim beat the Talmidim even during the 3 weeks. He has a hezber for that too. Again, that's all what we're not getting into. But we saw what the Mechaber said in Sif Yud Zayin. Toiv li zoher milemer Shehechiyanu Bein Hametzarim al pri oyal malbush. Now that's an interesting way of wording it. Now if you look in Itza Gavriel, like I said, that's probably the sefer I would have checked years ago, contemporary sefer that summarizes the halachos. So, Itza Gavriel Perek Zayin begins, Yesh li zoher Malavarich Shehechiyanu Bimei Bein Hametzarim, Metzayin to the Shulchan Aruch. And then a bit further, in Eis Daled, he follows up, Kivin she'aseh levarich Shehechiyanu, lachein aser liknois eilulbish beged chadash b'yamim elu mipnei shetzarich levarich alav Shehechiyanu. So therefore, it would be forbidden to obtain, to wear beged chadash during these days, because you would need to make a Shehechiyanu. And signed to the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. If you look it up, you'll see it in the Mishnah Brura as well. The Mishnah Brura, Sifkat and Sadik Tes, Al Pri, Al Malbush, Umemela, Lo Yechel Al Pri, Velo Yilbash HaBeged. Although it's interesting because that's not how the Mechaber phrased it. It's interesting wording. Mechaber said, first of all, Toiv Li Zoher, which I guess we'll get back to as well, but Toiv Li Zoher Milaymar, Al Pri, Al Malbush, and that's all the Mechaber said. The Mechaber stopped there and said, you should avoid making a Shehechiyanu. What exactly does that mean? Interesting way of putting it. Now, when it comes to the 9 days, as we quoted earlier, Kelim Chodashim, Aser Lulbish. It's Aser to wear new Kelim. That was very clear and very straightforward. And that's how you express yourself when you want to be clear and straightforward. And here it's, don't make a Shehechiyanu. So that means, what that suggests, what that indicates, is that there is some kind of fundamental difference before we get to the applications and whether the way it's stated in these Mekayros is strictly applicable to our situation today. We must first just observe and acknowledge this fundamental difference, that there's an Isser, Lulbish Kelim Chodashim during the 9 days, and that makes sense. It's Isser to wear freshly laundered clothing, according to the Halacha. So surely Kelim Chodashim would be Isser, so it sounds more fundamental to the idea of wearing the clothing itself, not any ramifications down the road of what happens when you wear new clothing. No, the new clothing themselves are the problem. Whereas when it comes to the 3 weeks, the problem is somehow the Shehechiyanu, without it even being originally fully outright stated that therefore there's a problem with actually doing the thing, wearing the thing. The problem is the Shehechiyanu. So the question is, of course, what is the makar? Where does this Shehechiyanu thing during the 3 weeks even come from? So if you look into it, if you look further into it, and there are a number of places you could do that. One place you might do that is in Shehechiyanu, the book. There's a sefer, Shehechiyanu, by Rabbi Moshe Bar Mordechai Chaim HaKoyim, printed in the year Tafshinai and Hay. It has about 500 pages of halachos, plus more pages with Haisafas. And so the sefer, in fact, does have a dedicated chapter, chapter 18, Shehechiyanu Bimei Bein Hametzarim. But like I said, this is not exclusive information. This is reproduced in many svarim. It says in Sefer Chasidim, Siman Taf Taf Mem, Yesh min ha-Chasidim harishonim shleihayu oichlem pri chadash. In fact, in Sefer Chasidim, it seemingly only mentions the pri chadash. Bein Yud Zayin Tamuz lates ba'av, ki amru, because they said, Eich nevarich alav Shehechiyanu v'kiyamanu v'higiyanu lizman hazeh v'hu zman puranos. You have to stop and think about the bracha, the meaning of the bracha. And really, this is perhaps a larger, more interesting topic, the mohus of Birchas Shehechiyanu, what it actually means and represents and how it works, and especially in the context of some of the complications, some of the confusion that arises today with whether and how one should still make a Shehechiyanu on various things. But focusing on this narrow point for the meanwhile, they said Shehechiyanu, the brach of Shehechiyanu is In some sense, we are rejoicing, as the bracha suggests, that we have reached this very moment in time. We are celebrating and thanking Hashem for this moment in time, and we're saying, wow, we made it, we arrived, we're here. This is such a great time to be alive. What a time to be alive. So those Chassidim Rishonim said, is this appropriate? It's the Bein Hametzarim, it's the 3 weeks, it's Zman Paranos. Does it seem appropriate? Does it seem in keeping with the tone, with the vibe of these weeks, of these days, to say, wow, so exciting, what a time to be alive? So that is actually the makar, that is actually both the makar and the yisoid for this idea. There's nothing wrong with the pri, if you think about it. There's nothing wrong with the malbush. It's just that, according to halacha, the way we engage and react to a pri chadash and a malbush chadash is by saying Shehechiyanu, by celebrating that moment. And the Chassidim Rishonim said it doesn't seem appropriate to be celebrating, to be expressing a bracha that says, what a great moment this is. So, getting back to that distinction, during the 9 days, there's a problem with the clothing. During the 3 weeks, the weeks that precede the 9 days, the problem is with the words Shehechiyanu v'kiyamanu b'giyanu l'zman hazeh. Now the Beis Yosef actually cites this already in the Beis Yosef on the Torah. The Torah did not mention this. The Beis Yosef cites it b'shem Tshuva Ashkenazis, b'shem the Sefer Chassidim, and apparently the Mechaber liked it so much that he incorporated it on his own, even as a Sfardi. He incorporated it as Toiv Lihizoher in the Shulchan Aruch towards the end of the Siman. Now let's, for the sake of this discussion, accept this as binding. Let's accept the Shulchan Aruch's formulation of Toiv Lihizoher as binding. The question then is, what does that mean practically speaking? What if there is a Pri Chadash? What if there is a Malbush Chadash? Since the Mechaber didn't exactly spell out what the ramifications are. So there is a discussion in various seforim, as to whether there might be the option of going ahead and eating the Pri Chadash without a Shehechiyanu, etc. Now, it might be worth keeping in mind that the makar, the original makar, the Sefer Chassidim, did actually phrase it as they would refrain from eating it so as not to make the bracha. But a lot of the discussion sort of just concerns the way the Mechaber formulated it. So if you look in the Shehechiyanu book that I mentioned before, he's actually metzayin to an interesting minor controversy, a back and forth between the Shut Be'er Mayim Chaim and the Chida in his Shilos Teshuvos. Now, I'll admit, I was not immediately familiar with who the author of Shut Be'er Mayim Chaim is. Not a top 10 or top 50 Shilos Teshuvos, not a statement as to the stature of the Mechaber. It's just simply not, I would say, especially famous. But I was able to determine with a little effort that we are referring to Sefer Be'er Mayim Chaim, Shechiber, Harav, Hamufla, etc. Kvoy, Merenu Harav, Reb Chaim, Nisim, Rafael, Mossiri. I'm guessing in English it's spelled and pronounced Mossiri. Uvoy Shleisha Seforim Neftachim, this Shilos Teshuvos, and other sections as well, printed in Saloniki in the year Tov Kuf Nun Daled, 1794, approximately. So, hasn't been reprinted since, as far as I know. Small, broken Rashi letters. But that is the Sefer we are referring to. And indeed, sure enough, there in the Sefer, which is Chelik Aleph, in Siman Zayin, She'ela, Ma'u Lacha Pri Chadash Ben Hametzarim B'loi Birchas Shehechiyanu, and he has lengthy tshuva, delving into whether Shehechiyanu is a reshus or a chayva, and he seems to be leaning very heavily towards saying that Birchas Shehechiyanu is a reshus. So whenever you are faced with the chiyuv or the option of saying Shehechiyanu, he believes it's just a reshus, the i-boy mevarech, the i-boy loy mevarech. There's obviously more to it, but that seems to be the point in a nutshell. And he discusses this for about 2 pages or so, and then he fears ice towards the end. Deleika Chacham Ksainis Yosef, who had already addressed this, and who had said that it's not okay, and he says this is wrong, and Evazoi Vimkain Toira Yoitza the Bein Hametzarim Matzi Ochel Beloi Hai Bracha Umanim Litzu Lechiki, how beautiful, how geschmack, how sweet are Divrei Maran HaKadosh Zal B'Shulchan Aruch the Mechaber the Diek B'Lishna Itaka, the Lashon is very meduyik B'Kasav Toiv Lizar Milei Shehechiyanu, etc. The Loi Kapid Harav Ela Al HaBracha Loi Al Achilas HaPri. The problem is the bracha, not the fruit, not eating the fruit itself. Just make the actual ha'etz, and that's it. When he draws a contrast to Sif Vav earlier, where it was clear that Aser to wear Kelim Chadashim, and when is it Aser? Only the week of. So the way he reads it is, the Mechaber was actually being very clear. The Isser of Kelim Chadashim is Shabbos Shechol B'Tisha B'Av. And then there's an additional issue of making the Shehechiyanu, so don't make the Shehechiyanu. Already the Bach had made this connection to saying, well, it looks like in that case you shouldn't be eating the pri and having the beged, buying or wearing the beged during the 3 weeks in which the Magen Avram cites. If you look in the Magen Avram there, by the way, he gives an afkamina between the 3 weeks and the 9 days. That if you bought a beged metukan, the clothing was ready to go, and you made a Shehechiyanu when you bought it, and that was before Yud Zayin Tamuz. Now you want to wear it, so if it's Bein Hametzarim, you'd be allowed to wear it now, because the Shehechiyanu is Shein Gemacht. There's no problem wearing something new. Mashenkin, during the 9 days, Taka, then you wouldn't be allowed to wear it, else a beged chadash. And here he concludes, and I should just clarify for the record, that I mentioned the Chaim Yosef just a bit before. He was disagreeing with the Chaim Yosef specifically about the pratim of the chi of Shehechiyanu. But he actually quotes the Chaim Yosef specifically on this question in Siman Yadav. Now that I mentioned the Chaim Yosef, who's the Chaim Yosef? Chaim Yosef is another lesser-known sefer in Chibur. His name was apparently Rabbi Yosef Montekiu, and he printed his sefer in Saloniki in Tafkuf Chav Gimel, 1763. So there's this whole world of seforim and Piskei Teshuvos that are perhaps somewhat invisible to today's audience, but were more important, had greater significance in the back and forth and the discussions of their day. And as we shall see, the Chida waded in and responds to Be'er Mayim Chaim. So the Chida, being someone who's somewhat more famous in this day and age, but he's responding to these other seforim, so it's at least important in as much as it's part of that discussion, or perhaps it's important regardless. At any rate, the Chaim Yosef in Siman Yud Aleph also had addressed this specifically. I'm not going to look that up, but he says the Chaim Yosef's conclusion was the same. We're eating flesh and geschmack of food, and it's fine to eat. So dafka pri chadash all of a sudden, and he reiterates, so the time is shall davar any elamishim habracha loimi tam achil. The problem is the bracha, not the eating. So there's a pashat v'kachani oisa ma'isa lecha kol pri chadash hanira la'aniyas daiti kosafti v'chasamti shmi Chaim Mossiri sat samachtas. So that was his psak. Now, in fact, we find that the Chida responds, the Chida in Shas Teshuvos Yosef Eimet, Siman and Vav, and he has his whole arichas pushing back against the Shut Be'er Mayim Chaim by name, and he has his whole arichas to prove that saying a Shehechiyanu is a chiyuv, and v'mloi beirach, havera biyadosh, and it's chayav the baruch Shehechiyanu, v'loi beirach, and so on and so forth in this vein. V'hu hepach mashakasav Maharach Mossiri, who was still alive at the time, and he fears this section of his discussion a bit sharp, and he says, "V'gam hu hafach dinoi b'asher hu oiseh lecher b'shat v'nefesh kol pri chadash b'li Shehechiyanu." This is what he paskins. This is what he does to eat. Disgraceful. U'be'emes ani tamei alav. I'm taken aback. Shesemech kol kachal daito. He's so sure of himself. Laker minig kavua b'roiv yisrael mimoitza mimayrav shalei lecher pri chadash ben Hametzarim. Chida phrases it as there's a minig everywhere. Yidden don't eat a pri chadash, and you throw a few svaris around and you're willing to change the halacha and act differently. V'rav guvrei levato minig abeseinu v'rabeseinu v'lasas ma'isa v'kasav b'sefer v'ima yaslicha. He has a problem with that. He does a bit sharp, a bit harsh. He goes on and says his whole diktuk, his whole diuk from Mechaber and Shulchan Aruch. Says, I don't think Mechaber meant that the Yochel b'li Shehechiyanu kasher chashav. No, kavanasa sheyamtin melech l'pri chadash ad achar Tisha B'av. Now the Be'er Mayim Chaim is nishka blib and shuldik. He had the last word. Posthumously, after he passed away, I believe the Tafkuf Ayans, they printed Be'er Mayim Chaim Chelik Beis, And there in Siman Beis, he's in the middle of responding to some points the Chida raised against him on different halachos. So Siman Beis, short Siman, he writes, Order isi sham shehir balahakshus alai b'mashapasakti b'sifri be'ermayim chayim chelak eira chayim Siman Zayin demut lecho pri chadash ben Hametzarim b'li bercha Shehechiyanu. And the be'ermayim chayim says, V'hera ladas the kavanosai hi lahasig. Here's where he really proved that he's just out to chepezich with me. The Anika Safti, what I wrote, is based on a simple reading of the Gemara. As agreed to by other Achreinim, the Meinim of Aruch Shehechiyanu, Ein Olav Shem Einish. And surely the Mechaber holds this as well. And I stand by my reading of the Mechaber here, where the Mechaber said, Toiv li zor milay Shehechiyanu. And then he adds, Umilanu Gadol, Mimirenu Arav Reb Chaim Vital, Hu v'Rabbonei Doirei She'asu Maisa, V'achlu Bli Bircha Shehechiyanu. Now what is he talking about? It's interesting because actually the Chida mentions this. The Chida and Yosef omit and Siman and Vav, when he discusses this issue, the Chida himself writes, "V'Yosef Yiksha Mashakosov Harav Makubel Mahari Tzamach Zal Bahagahoisov Ksav Yad V'Hevesev Ani Hadal B'Birka Yosef Siman Tovkuf Nun Aleph." And the Chida adds, "V'Ator Isi Sheken Kosov Mishmoy V'Pri Etz Chaim Sham Sheshama Meharav Kavoid Marinu Harav Reb Shmuel Vital Ben Harav Marinu Harav Reb Chaim Vital Zal." It happened once that Hayu Chachmei Adar Oichlin al Shulchan Aviv. Shmuel is relating that the Chachmei Adar were eating at Reb Chaim's table, Chaim Vital's table. If Tziru Boy Lachol Pri Chadash, they insisted that he eat a Pri Chadash. V'achal Eisai B'li Bircha Shehechiyanu Ad Kan L'Shayne. And indeed, he ate it without a Shehechiyanu. Kvar Ani Atzar. The Chida says, I've already commented on this in Birka Yosef Sham. That's in the Lashon of Reb Chaim Vital. In Shara Kavanas, it's mashman. I guess I'll get to that. I really wanted to get to this later. The Arizal of Chaim Vital, there's a statement on this which sounds a lot stronger towards not eating anything, not wearing anything. And yet, so that's Reb Chaim Vital himself, and yet Reb Shmuel Vital, as transmitted by Rav Yaakov Tzemach, and you can look this up, it's in the Pri Etz Chaim Take. So you have the Pnim, which is copied from Reb Chaim Vital's Lashon, about Pri Chadash and the Levush Chadash, and then there's Agot Tzemach Siper Li Benoi Shel Rav Chaim Vital Zal Ki Zoiche Shepam Achas Hayu Chachmei Adar Oichlin al Shulchan Aviv V'Aftiru B'Lechu Pri Chadash V'Ochel Oisem Bli Shehechiyanu V'Zeh Kol Oisen Hayamim Shebein Hametzarim. So that's the Agot of Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach in the Pri Etz Chaim. It appears that Rabbi Shmuel Vital himself did not record this himself, because Rabbi Shmuel Vital also wrote Hagoyos on the Shmeina She'arim of Rabbi Chaim Vital. Doesn't seem like he mentioned this himself, as far as I'm aware. But Yaakov Tzemach said he had a conversation, Siperli B'noi Shel Rav Chaim Vital. That's where the Chida is saying, I saw it in the Hagoyos Ksav Yad of Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, and now I saw in the Pri Etz Chaim Tak, it's printed Mishmoi of Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, Sheshama from Shmuel Vital. And the Chida is saying, yes, Rabbi Chaim Vital himself wrote what he wrote. Rabbi Shmuel Vital, who was Mesader, copied his father's writings, wrote what he wrote. So what are we to make of this? So the Chida did mention it, he did acknowledge it, he said he already quoted it in Birka Yosef, and now here he's, even in the midst of the debate, he's mentioning it, he's acknowledging it. And the Chida says, he has a lot of questions, and you don't have many answers. So, what is the story? Mative shel ma'aseh zeh shesiper Rav Marash Vital. This is what happened. B'teima Rabban and Kadish, it's a question. Eichle nizru b'zeh. Why were they not particular? Da'as lecho pri chadash ben Hametzarim. Here the Chida kind of acknowledges, is the wording asur or is the wording yesh lehizar? But at the very least, yesh lehizar, so why were they not nizar? Besu, moreover, amai hiftsiru, why were they being so insistent to Reb Chaim Vital and forced him to act against his own opinion, his own wishes? And moreover, why did he listen to them? Zak the Chida v'yesh lases ukimtis, I guess we can farenfer, maybe it was Shabbos, so that's one way to sidestep the issue. Or some Achreinim talk about what if you know for a fact you won't have the pri later, so you're mamish losing the opportunity to eat the pri, so maybe that's a mitigating factor. Or maybe Reb Chaim Vital, he was a little sick, maybe there was some medicinal property, and today we know from Reb Chaim Vital's other writings that Reb Chaim Vital had a great interest in all these additional areas of alchemy and medicine, etc. So it wouldn't be out of character if that was the case. So perhaps that's why they were insisting. There was some medical dimension to the episode. But then the problem is, the question is, why did Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach not convey this additional information? So he says, Chaim Vital, shver, pashat shver, based on what he himself wrote. Like I wrote in Piskei Yosef already. And Gam Yesh Laharga Shal Rav Shmuel Vital, who writes all his father's minhagim. If this is a story that Rabbi Shmuel Vital was telling people, why didn't Rabbi Shmuel Vital record the story? If he would have recorded the story, probably would have been more helpful. Then later, once again in the tshuva, from the part that we covered earlier, the part where he goes through the halacha, Shehechiyanu, the shusar chayva, and his conclusion is chayva, and then he rips a bit into the Bein Chaim, and then he says that the Pshat and Shulchan Aruch is nicht like the Bein Chaim said, and surely the Mechaber himself intended that one should wait till after Tisha B'Av. So towards that, the end of that discussion, he returns to this point as well. So Mashakasa, Marit Samach, Shift Tziru, B'Mereinu of Chaim Vital, V'chulu, Kvar Kasavnu Le'el, already said, Shalay Yadanu Gufa De'uvda, Hechi Hava, we don't know what happened, but Rav Marit Samach Zal, Kitzer, Esarachav. So there's so little information, there's inadequate data that we really can't make much of this anecdote. That's how the Chida addressed it at length in this tshuva. But you could say that's perhaps the weak point in his presentation, because the story exists. So sure enough, back to the Bein Chaim's final word in Chelik Beis. So he says, Milanu Gadol. He didn't even know about this apparently when he wrote Chelik Aleph. And now the Chida handed him this gift, this free information that's very helpful to his case. And then he goes even further and says, you know who else was in that circle from Chaim Vital? I'll tell you who. Maybe the Mechaber was also sitting there at that table. Maybe he too was there when they insisted that Reb Chaim Vital eat the fruit. So the Mechaber himself was noeg halacha l'maisa. Either others who might have a different opinion, if you would see Azam Maiserav, and here there's an interesting line which caught my attention. Hamuva b'sefer ches mem yud, which those who know will immediately know is referring to Chemdas Yamim, hanitpas mechadash sheheviyai. So this story is cited there as well. So if they would see this, the Bala Shita, that Shehechiyanu, which we are connecting this debate and this discussion to. So he who says that it's an Aveda, he would see this Ma'aser, the Chaim Vital. Not only would he know that it's not a problem during the 3 weeks, but by extension, you would know that it's not a problem to eat without with skipping the Shehechiyanu. I'll get back to the Chemdas Yamim in a second. At any rate, Bein Chaim says, look at all of this. Back to the Chida. Kol shekin shedvar of kashim lahilmam. How could you make sense of what the Chida is saying? How strange that this Chacham, he himself is very aware of this Maiserav. So this is a very easy score for him, and he just, in his mind, destroys the Chida with this story. Obviously, the Chida spoke about it at great length, and it's a bit tortured, but the Chida is firm in his opinion, and he's not swayed by the story. He thinks the story is just, doesn't know what to make of the story. But Bein Chaim says, I don't have that problem. I know what to make of the story. The story is perfect. But I just want to comment a bit on that line, that in addition to these Makaitis, Hamuva b'sefer Chemdas Yamim hanitpas mechadash sheheviyai. Now, if you know anything about the Chemdas Yamim, now we know the Chemdas Yamim was the sefer that was printed around this time in the 1700s, and it walks you through the year with sort of just like a guide that takes you through the Yamim Tovim, the special days of the year, and it quotes all of the inspiration from Kabbalistic sources, and it was just considered a very inspirational sefer. If you were someone who wanted to live the Jewish year with Kabbalistic influence, Kabbalistic inspiration, this was the handbook for you. And it was very popular. The only problem is that there's been this never-ending murmuring about the Sefer as to whether it's compromised by the beliefs of Shabtai Tzvi. And this is a huge, huge topic, and it's a battle still being waged till today. And I don't want to get into the topic itself, but one of the points that's usually raised in this discussion is that suspiciously the Chemdas Yamim does not contain Hilchos Bein Hametzarim. And that's usually a telling sign that the followers of Shabtai Tzvi believed that Mashiach had already arrived, certain things had already been rectified, fast days are abolished, the 3 weeks would surely be abolished. So a sefer like this, that's conspicuously missing the halachos of Bein Hametzarim, it might be telling you something. So this is, if you're familiar, this might be something that you might remember. Now, the Bein Chaim is saying that this Maisa is brought in Sefer Chemdas Yom Nitpas Mechadash. So, what does that mean? What's that referring to? So I went to look a bit, and sure enough, if you look in the first print of Chemdas Yamim from the year Tov Tzadik Aleph, the year 1731, Chelik Gimel, sure enough, you'll see it goes straight from Shavuos into El, with nothing in between. So there's certainly no story there about Rabbi Chaim Vital and Bein Hametzarim. But if you look at, Eicha Chachma has both of these, if you look at Chemdas Yamim Tov Kuf Chav Beis, so 1766, and you look at Chelik Gimel, you'll see, just look at the Sharblat, it says Sefer Chemdas Yamim Legimel Regalim Ula Bein Hametzarim Ula Tisha B'Av. So it's right there in the subheading. And the Sharblat continues to say that this edition has Haisafis. It's written in the very flowery melitzos of the day, but the melitzos allude to the fact that there are 4 Haisafis in this edition of Chemdas Yamim. Pirush HaHaggadah from Rabbi Yosef Jikatilia. The second thing is Kavanas Tainas Tzibur, Tainas Shulchan from the Meiri. Ushlishi b'kodesh in Yanim noim hashayachim liyemais hakayetz ulevein hametzarim uletisha b'av. Bedal b'kodesh kavanas Arizal lebein hametzarim. So 2 out of the 4 hisafis are matters relating to Bein Hametzarim. So this is a better edition. This has more content. It has Bein Hametzarim stuff. Very innocently, just saying that, we added Haggadah stuff, we added Tainas Tzibur stuff, and we added Bein Hametzarim stuff. Of course, it might not be so innocent, at least the absence, the omission previously might not be so innocent. I don't know what this Moitzi La'ur was thinking, and whether he thought it was innocent or not, but wants to sell a better product, so it's a better product, we have more content. Then when you turn the pages, you go to page Ayin Beis. After Shavuos, there's a special message, Amar HaMatpis, Shtabach HaYetzer, V'yis'al HaBeire, Shehechiyanu, V'kimani, V'giyani. Maybe it's a bit ironic to be using Shehechiyanu and announcing that you're sharing halachos for Bein Hametzarim, although it begins with halachos hashayachim bakayetz, so I guess you could say Shehechiyanu. That's just just a small inside joke, I guess, for those following along here. But the Matpis says, wow, Hashem Mamash helped me to print the chalakim of the Chemdas Yamim, but oidzoi sosisi yotzasi achri hakoitzrim lalakit shikcha upeya. Some things that were forgotten, etc., that the Sefer could use. Likuti basa likuti kama dvarim asher matzasi hoin li misukim bedvash v'noifes tzufim divrei chayfetz, etc., etc. And it's about divrei hayam shebekayetz ubein hametzarim. And Hashem knows how much effort I put into it, right? So this is new content. So he sort of had to write perhaps in the style of the original Baal Chemdas Yamim and fill in those gaps, the Shikha Upeya. And then over the course of a few prakim, prints the halachos hashiyachim bekayetz, and then he concludes those, and he has a different amatpis again. Omen amatpis, yinekedem shenaschal ahatpis, in yebin hametzarim, v'tainis yud zayin, v'tamuz v'tisha b'av. I figured I would copy this text of the Meiri relating to Tinius, which I believe we said was mentioned on the Sharblat as well. So that's the next section. And then following that, we have Hilchos Bein Hametzarim. Taka filling in that section of the Chemdas Yamim that was missing. Tanam, Perek Basar de Tainis, Chamisha Devarim, Edo Laviseinu, starting from scratch, starting from the basics, going through the halachos in that style. And then they're talking on page Pei Gimel. Gam yesh kaisvim de'ein levarach Shehechiyanu b'yomim elu. V'chein kosuv Rabbeinu b'beis Yosef sefsim tovkuf non aleph, etc., etc. And then he writes v'kachum in hagi. I think that's also in keeping with the stylistic voice of the mechaber of the Chemdas Yamim. V'kachum in hagi shloi levarach Shehechiyanu afilu b'reish chedush v'shabbasis shabin sayim, relating to that whole discussion. V'chein matzasi b'kuntresi ha'ari. All in the style of the Chemdas Yamim. Then he adds, tzamach, which is how the Hagoyos of tzamach are introduced. Tzamach, sipur li b'noi shalarav, chacham hashalem, ki hu zeiche, shapa'amachas, ad kan l'shaynei. Now he hasn't necessarily been fully clear on what his stance is. He said, my minig is, Shloi levarach Shehechiyanu. A lot of the language was Shloi levarach, Shloi levarach. So what does that mean? Can you eat without making a Shehechiyanu, or by Shloi levarach do you mean not to eat? So up until here is not clear, and even as he quotes it, maybe not clear. But then he continues and he says, Im kol zeh af shemen hagi ulahachmir. As I said, but if there's an ishamu beres, so then even if it's not some major overwhelming desire, but certainly not appropriate for an isha mubaras. The ein lo linhoig az chsidus. This is not. It's ultimately still a midas chsidus. It comes from sefer chsidim. It's tovli zar, whatever the lashonos are. So it's not for her. Adrabe isura ka'av. That's bad for her because it might cause nezek to her and the vlad. Ach bli birchas Shehechiyanu al pima shekasav b'zeh Rav Tzamach that we just quoted above. Here he briefly summarizes the state of discussion on this in the Achreinim that came up in those other teshuvos as well. And even though there's the Shita that says that it's not a Rishos, specifically, like we said, Ishim Uberes, Yochel Lismich ala Peskim Aniskal El, V'lachal Eisam B'li Birchas Shehechiyanu Kanal. I got the sefer Nagadu Mitzava. Back then, these seforim weren't necessarily printed, and or they were being printed one at a time over many decades. So anyone dealing with these issues was probably working with an incomplete record. The Chida seems like the type who probably had the most complete record, relatively speaking, to the rest. But only really from the comfort of today's day and age can we really just kick our feet back and say, we have all the information in front of us, and now we can judge the people, the Gedolim, the Chachamim, who didn't quite have all that information. At any rate, he says, I obtained the Sefer Nagadu Mitzava by Rabbi Yaakov Tzamach, which is sort of a formal work that he put out there. The Sham Halachos Elu, after he says that we don't need a Pri Chadash, etc., he writes, Tzamach, so he briefly also expressed the variation of this idea that he doesn't say Yishim Abaris, he says b'makom chayli, and perhaps one can speculate this is actually alluding to one of the ukimtus that the Chida proposed, that maybe there was a shtickle refuah. He's going further than a refuah. He's just saying that it's Pesachim le'tavasai. It helps build the appetite to eat healthy foods. So it gives you a bit more, some more dimension to how Yaakov Tzamach viewed this halacha, this minig, this issue. By the way, to be clear, if Chemdas Yamim Tavkuf Chav Beis has the Nagadu Mitzava, of course, Alachas Kam Bakama, that the Chida had the Nagadu Mitzava, and he did quote it in that Shuvah, although I didn't notice that he alluded to that particular passage or saw any significance in it, just to make that clear. At any rate, this is the record now that was in front of the Berman Chaim Chelik Beis. So he says, Meister Av Kazeh HaMuva B'Sefer Chemdas Yom Manitus B'Chadash Sheheviyoi. So this is what he's referring to. This whole Hamshach, this whole Arichas in the Chemdas Yamim, in the Isafad L'Bein Hametzarim, from the edition of Tafkuf Chav Beis, which goes through all these inyanim and has its own discussion and treatment. And I guess when he read it, he saw that the Baal Chemdas Yamim the Baal Hisafas L'Chemdas Yamim had alluded to this Shehechiyanu debate and had taken the side that to Rosh, and based on that, he had been Mekel and pointed to the Nagadu Mitzava, who also seems to be Mekel a bit, taking a more lenient stance than the Chida in his attack on the Bein Chaim, and the Bein Chaim therefore feels that he's fully in the right, and the Chida is just, as we said, just trying to chapizich with him. It's actually interesting to point out, speaking of the Hisafis to Chemdas Yamim on this issue, that I mentioned before that many years ago, after I got the Nitya Gavril on Bein Hametzarim, I got the Chaim Vital. The Chaim Vital is the volume on Tinius. It's on Moedim, so that's the volume on Tinius, and I also had that at a relatively early stage. So actually, if you look on the Hakdama there, right in the beginning, it says, Oida Hashem Moed B'fi, the next paragraph, B'halachos elu huva lafanai sefer Chemdas Yamim. Big disclaimer. I'm quoting the Chemdas Yamim Bein Hametzarim, and I know, and he goes off with this whole thing. I know the back of Emden has suspicions about the Chemdas Yamim, etc., etc., and he goes off on to that whole discussion. And I know the Munkacher attacked Reb Chaim Palachi, who defended the Chemdas Yamim, and he attacked the Svardim and said the Svardim are inferior, and that's racism, and whole harichas from Rabbi Yaakov, from Ovadia Yosef. Then after the whole defensive rant about, he's going to quote from the Chemdas Yamim Bein Hametzarim, and he's fine with it, and he's proud with it, and whatever, he's not being intimidated by these Ashkenazim. At the end, there are two lines. Shuv reisi, shekol ma shekasa b'sefer Chemdas Yamim b'hilchos Bein Hametzarim, mevur, shehu likut, me'arav hagoyin ha'moitzi la'or, b'nutpas b'levarno, shnas tafuf chavbeis, ayin sham. So, Ovadia Yosef, it's a kechap that if you actually just pay attention, you see that's Bechlal not from the original Mechaber. So, Addendum, you want to quote from there, is doch sehr gut, but that whole Arichas was a bit misplaced. Just a bit of amusement, a bit of irony relating to this Hisafa. And speaking of Chaim Vital, so back in the Sefer Shehechiyanu, after citing the Bein Chaim versus the Chida, he says there's another Shalos Teshuvos that says, maybe we should learn from the Meister Chaim Vital that if you were invited with Gedolim to a Suda and they insist that you eat a Pri Chadash, you're allowed to eat it with Pnei HaKavod B'li Bracha, like Reb Chaim Vital. And in Chaim Vital, on Tinius, page 137, Ovadia Yosef responds and replies that it's shver kasher l'smoch hazeh l'maisa, and we see how harsh the Chida was on the topic, so ein lemeden meira asha. So that's that discussion. And that's the ha'ara on those who say that you could skip the Shehechiyanu and eat the Pri Chadash. And then he says, V'yei shayimrim, she'ein lachol Pri Chadash klal b'yom elu. Maimer Mordechai, the Chida, as we said. So that's sort of that discussion that we just went off a bit on because there was an interesting diversion. But that's the state of the discussion as summarized there on whether that would mean that, you could go ahead and do it anyway and just skip the Shehechiyanu. So let's assume for the purpose of this discussion that were you to make a Shehechiyanu, you can't just say, you know what, I'm going to skip the Shehechiyanu. But now comes the question regarding a Beged Chadash. And this is really why I got into this whole discussion here, which is, the reality is that people are not making Shechiyanus in the wild, really neither on a Pri Chadash or on a Beged Chadash. And that's really perhaps worthy of its own discussion, and I have some thoughts and some insights, proposed insights on this whole topic of the nature of the Bracha of Shehechiyanu and why it might be relevant or not relevant. In Chabad specifically, it's not really a thing, stamazoi, but on Rosh Hashanah, when you're supposed to make a Shehechiyanu anyway, and there's this idea that maybe you should also be doing something else, so there's this idea that maybe they'd have a war, a Beged Chadash to enhance the Shehechiyanu. Meaning Chabad certainly is to make a Shehechiyanu, to say a Shehechiyanu on a Pri Chadash at the Suda of Rosh Hashanah, and there probably needs to be a discussion on the correct way to do it to ensure that that it's worthy of a Shehechiyanu, and that's its own discussion. But there are those who go further and say that you really should never make a Shehechiyanu on Pri Chadash purely for halachic reasons, because it's a bit weird and complicated today. With regard to a Beged, not as, I haven't seen anything as adamant about that one shouldn't. But Pashtus, I guess the seforim all still say that one should make a Shehechiyanu on a Beged Chadash. But the reality is that unless maybe it's like a tziruf to something, like I said, Rosh Hashanah and the like, doesn't really seem like people are organically on their own. They've got a Beged Chadash. They're not making a Shehechiyanu. Now, halacha, the earlier Makaidas do allude to this a bit. This is in Siman Reish Chav Gimel and Shulchan Aruch. It's discussed a bit about some begadim that an ashir wouldn't make a Shehechiyanu, but maybe an ani, for whom it's more scarce and more of an excitement, maybe the ani would make a Shehechiyanu. Should the ani make a Shehechiyanu? Or are some begadim of such low importance that even the ani shouldn't make a Shehechiyanu? So you have the Mechaber in Siman Reish Chav Gimel, Sevav, al davar she'eni chashav kol kach ken chaluk, oim in olam v'am palois, ein levarach aleihem, v'im hu ani v'sameach behem yevarach, hagah from the Ramah, v'yesh eminim dafilu ani ein mevarach, al chaluk, in olam v'chadema v'chein noigen. So we sort of downgraded a certain category of clothing which no one makes a Shehechiyanu on. And then there's a Magen Avram. The Magen Avram on the v'chein noigen says that v'asher gadol shekana kelim chashuvim she'en sameach b'hem ve'en echshavim lo'en. If you're an asher, you are operating on a level where even the kelim chashuvim are not a simcha to you, and they're not chashuv to you, you're not feeling the emotion, lo yivarech. And again, like I said, there's a lot to discuss about the emotion of Shehechiyanu and what that emotion is expressing. But there is this concept in the Magen Avram that an asher wouldn't make a Shehechiyanu if it's no big deal to him. And by the way, for Chabad, Alter Rebbe, we don't have Siman Reish Chav Gimel and Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, but we have Seder Berachos Hanan, Perek Beis, which deals with Shehechiyanu. It says, V'chol zeh b'veged chashuv, sheliba shel adam sameach boy. That's the Alter Rebbe is defining it. We're obviously machshav, the Alter Rebbe's lashon, that the Alter Rebbe has very, very clear, sharp definitions in these halachic areas. So, without getting into it, I'm just pointing out, sheliba shel adam sameach boy, that's what we're looking for. That's the emotion we're looking for with a beged chashuv. It might not be the same with a Pri Chadash, by the way, but that's a different discussion. Al davar she'eni chashuv kol kach ein levarach aleihem. The ani v'sameach behem yevarech. The Alter Rebbe says it's fully subjective. That if you are an ani, then you would make a bracha even on min al nam pilois, not seemingly what the Ramah said. But asher gadol shekana b'gadim chashuvim she'eni sameach behem apnei she'enam nechshav me'atzloi lo yevarech. Then the Alter Rebbe adds in Seder Berachos Hanan u'mdinas elunai gen shafilu ani einam mevarech al chaluk min olam. But even in Seder Berachos Hanan, which is not a place where the Alter Rebbe gets necessarily into the maze of shittas, it's interesting that the Alter Rebbe, it was important to the Alter Rebbe to sort of phrase it to the extreme, that it really should be completely up to your subjective experience as to whether you would experience simcha or not. So an ani would always, an usher would never. The Medinas Elu, the Aniyim stopped making a bracha on Cholakim and Olam. Anyway, so the takeaway from there, even the Shehechiyanu Sefer, he mentioned some, obviously, the basic Makairis, although I don't see that he's even is willing to go all the way out and acknowledge it. But the reality is that, I can't speak for Sfardim, but all the Ashkenazim that I know, they're not making this bracha. Now, you could say it belongs to a larger topic of a lot of these types of brachas, interesting brachas that people don't really necessarily make anymore. And there's much to say. But for the purpose of this discussion, Bein Hametzarim, the reality is, it seems, that people are not making the bracha anymore. And we could argue that it is because, to some extent, we are all like an usher gadol. Now, I can't speak, I guess, to women who buy $5,000 sheitlach wigs, or even Chsidish Yidden that have to buy Streimlach that are worth thousands of dollars. I can't speak to what that experience is like, and whether they should be making a Shehechiyanu, and whether they do or they don't. Or I guess people of means who are buying $1,000 suits, etc. But speaking for Stama Yid, Stama person, you buy a jacket here, you buy a pair of pants here, and so on and so forth. I think in my experience, I can only speak for myself, a suit and a jacket and a pair of pants is 100, 150, 200, 250. It depends, I guess, what level, what quality, or just how much the retail guy is marking it up. But it doesn't feel like a huge purchase, even for people that are not Ashirim. And I've heard this come up in conversation, even with regards to children, that someone was observing that really even in my own lifetime, in our lifetime, perhaps even 30 years ago, buying clothing for a child was a bigger deal, and today it's less so. And there have been changes in the fashion world, and I don't just mean high fashion, but the production of clothing has become very cheap, and clothing are seen as far more disposable. That obviously might not be a very good thing, and it might come at the expense of labor problems in other parts of the world, and it might be bad for our environment that we're just disposing of so many objects that were once not considered meant to be disposed of in such a way. Those are all larger issues and ramifications, but the metzius is that every year that passes, every decade that passes, clothing is just becoming more and more disposable. And this is something that's observable. People observe this and acknowledge this. So the case for making a Shehechiyanu gets smaller and smaller, unless, again, you're dealing with something that's a very expensive purchase. But that's usually not the case most of the time. And that's not the case when shilas come up regarding Bein Hametzarim. It's usually a person bought a new suit. Is buying a new suit, a $250 suit, considered a grace of simcha anymore? Not really. That would seem to be the reality. I haven't gone and looked. Like I said, the Sefer Shehechiyanu doesn't go close enough in addressing this. I'm sure there are some seforim out there that have. I haven't gone and done a overview of the entire literature on the topic. If anyone listening has more to add on this, I'd be very happy to see. But working with this assumption that there's a yesod in halacha that an usher doesn't say Shehechiyanu, and there's a yesod in this metzius that we see observably that people are not making Shehechiyanu. So now the shayla vertak, wait a second, what now is the halacha going to be in Bein Hametzarim? Because we established that the issue really is the bracha of Shehechiyanu, not the etzem halavisha. And even if we established that it seems to be more widely held that one shouldn't just eat a pri chadash, for example, and skip the Shehechiyanu, but that's seemingly only if you would otherwise be making the Shehechiyanu, and now you're skipping it. Obviously, we're not going to get to that. Obviously, we saw this whole debate about pri chadash, rishos, chayva. Most people aren't even thinking when it's any day that's not Rosh Hashanah as to whether they should be making a Shehechiyanu on weird fruit. I don't know how often people are eating exotic fruit. The halacha isn't even relating to exotic fruit. There's so much to speak about pri chadash, but whether or not rishus or chayva, no one's saying a Shehechiyanu on pri chadash tamazoi, unless you have the minig on Rosh Hashanah, and then the question is if you're doing it right. When it comes to a beged chadash, I didn't see whether there's also a debate on whether it's rishus or chayva, but anyway, we see this discussion regarding ani and asher, and we have this precedent, and reality is we're not saying Shehechiyanu. So now there is a serious case to be made that the Shulchan Aruch, Mishnah Berurah, even the Bach, going back, their formulation isn't really addressing and helpful to our situation. Litzig Avril just writing in the Pnim, therefore we don't get a beged. But wait a second, would you make a Shehechiyanu on that beged? So what I would suggest, my impression, my takeaway, I'm not saying kablu daiti, and perhaps different rabban and different places can have different cheshbainas, but just following the logic of this question, my sense would be is that certainly, on the whole, one should avoid it. That's like the Chida said, but the Pri Chadash, it's the minig of Klal Yisrael. You don't really want to mess with that. But I would feel that there are particular situations, a person's clothing suddenly got ripped, suddenly got dirty, they urgently need a replacement, or even if they needed the replacement a few days earlier and they kept on postponing it, they didn't it's ready for 3 weeks. There seemingly should be room to say that perhaps it's okay. Or someone just asked me the other day, he had the clothing from before and put it on, he needed alterations, without even getting into the shaila of when the correct time to say Shehechiyanu is. In that scenario, which the Magen Avraham sort of gets into in that discussion, that maybe he was supposed to say Shehechiyanu the final occasion. Considering that he had it and it dragged out, is it really necessary to be so stringent? Or is there room to cut some people some slack in these marginal situations at the margins and say, you know what, we're not mamish dealing with the precise case. that the Mechaber, etc., were all discussing all the way back to the Sefer Chassidim, where it was about avoiding saying Shehechiyanu, and in this case, clearly, no one had any intention of ever saying Shehechiyanu. I would think that there is some room here for leeway in light of everything we've seen on the topic of Shehechiyanu and Beged Chadash Bein Hametzarim. And again, like I said, I'm happy to hear feedback if you've seen seforim or you've heard hayros from Rabbanim in this day and age, how they address this and how they deal with this. But I think there's a case to be made, like I said. Just a few additional points to wrap up. I alluded earlier to the lashon of Tov Lizar, and Taka in the Sefer Shehechiyanu, Perek Ches, page 375, Ara 4, he says, Hine, Shulchan Aruch said, Tov Lizar. Midvarav shekos of Tov Lizar, mashma she'en ze iser mamish, elarak chumra ba'alma. We saw earlier also that the Chida kind of catches himself. He says, Da asr lechel, lechel apachas yesh lizar. But like I said, for the sake of the discussion, we accepted that it's binding. So here in this Sefer Shehechiyanu, he takes a moment to question and to challenge, wait a second, is it even binding? We also saw how the sophist at Chemdas Yamim says it's a chasidus, a chasidusa. That's a bit of a general question in a lot of halachic literature and minig literature. Often it just seems like it was being written to a certain elite group of people. And they're the audience, they're the ones that are reading it. No one's concerned about the pashta people who aren't reading the sefer, and they aren't even concerned with this question. On the other hand, especially whoever considers himself a member of a Hasidic movement, perhaps one could argue that Hasidic movements, by definition, took a lot of these inyanim that were previously seen as the domain of the elite, and those who were extra special, and sort of shared them and made them the domain of the klal. And that's really a whole other discussion about some of the aspects and elements of Chassidus and Chassidim. But anyway, putting that all aside, just focusing at the lashon, the Tov Lizar. So the fellow writing the sefer says, sounds like it's just a chumra ba'alma. Tov Lizar, achim b'ze iser. He says, V'her Hashem einai, I found in this day Chemed, in the Kolel Poskim, Shekasav Hashem Poskim, Shekasav Yesh Lizar, Haynu Dafka Lechatchila, Shekasav Min Adin, Ze Aser, V'lei Mishum Chassidus Ba'alma, B'dolei Kasav Tov Lizar. So Ebazoi, sounds like it's always Chassidus Ba'alma. It says, V'chein Kasav B'chazoi Nevadia Taka Arbetinius, Mashikasav Shulchan Aruch Lashon Tov Lizar, Zerak Chassidus Ba'alma, B'leka Afilu Iser D'Rabban, and again, the Chazoi Nevadia says a page later, Ein B'ze El Chumra Ba'alma, etc. He goes on a bit in this vein and throws in a few other makaitis that can be tied into this line of thinking. And he concludes, though, Mikal Makam after Shulchan Aruch Kasav Rak B'lashon Tov Lizar, V'chein Sefer Chassidim Kasav Yesh Me Chassidim Rishonim Shlo Hayu Eichlim Pri Chadash, which is also sort of limiting it and saying Yesh Me Ha Chassidim Rishonim. Mikal Makam Aminik Shlo Levarach B'Chei Shehechiyanu B'Mei Bein Hametzarim. I'm just sharing this just for the record because it's, I guess, worth acknowledging and observing, but personally I would not, as we say in Ivrit, lo yiti boneh al zeh, I wouldn't follow this line of reasoning. Whatever the lashon of the Mechaber was in Shulchan Aruch, from the tone of the Neisa Kelim that follow, it seems pretty clear that it's not just even minig for followers of the Arizal, the elite. It's very clear that the Neisa Kelim took it as pretty much the halacha, the minig, and that's how everyone observes it, and no one would feel comfortable suggesting that, it's just optional to that extent. Even in Ovadia Yosef, if you look at his presentation where he goes off into this point about how, it's mamish, not an isser at all, but even he just seems to be using it to make the point about how he would be lenient on Shabbos, to the question of whether you could be lenient on Shabbos, the chadoime. But the minig is the minig, and like I said, the Chida already mentions it, the Pri Chadash, that the minig is the minig. So that's not, I wouldn't see that as the basis. And someone who starts picking apart l'shoinus like that and wants to start undermining and overturning well-established parts of Yiddishkeit, it's never a good sign. But like I said, the question here is the Isser Shehechiyanu, and people who put on clothing are not making a Shehechiyanu. So that is, in a sense, fundamentally different than the specific thing the Mechaber was talking about. and the Nesakelim we're talking about. Another point I wanted to get to that I mentioned earlier was Taka the Lashon of the Arizal, and here I'm looking at the Shar HaTfilah from the Shmoyne Sha'arim, from the Ksav Yad of Rabbi Chaim Vital, his Madura Basra. The Lashon in Bein Hametzarim is Gam Tzarech Li Zoher V'Limana Milechel B'Yom Maheim Shum Pri Chadash V'Shaloi Lulboi Shum Levush Chadash Kedei Shaloi Tzarech Levarach Alav Birchas Shehechiyanu U'Kamei Shenisker Inyan Min Egzeh B'Sifrei HaPeskim HaAchreinim. So this is very emphatic language and wording where it's Shum Pri Chadash Shaloi Lulboi Shum Levush Chadash, which I think the Chida was alluding to in part of that discussion about how it's sort of very strong words from Chaim Vital there. On the other hand, even Rabbi Chaim Vital is continuing Shehechiyanu was still very much alive, acted upon practice at the time. So it's still tied to the halacha of saying Shehechiyanu. But I could also see how Chaim Vital saying it, and then like I said, the halachos of Arizal and Chaim Vital, especially for those among the Chassidim, sort of becoming universal. So I could see why someone would also shtelzach on that and say, that such strong words from Chaim Vital, Shum Pri Chadash, Shum Levush Chadash, maybe that's also another reason to be more machmer. But again, you could still kind of argue it either way. I just thought it's important to acknowledge that lashon of the Arizal is taka there. And I think that covers what I wanted to say directly to this topic. While we're closing out, I'll just throw in a few more cute details relating to Shehechiyanu. Taka from the Sefer, mentioned in the Sefer Shehechiyanu. One thing he mentions is Chav Beis Tamuz Bekahal Chasidei Karlin. He writes there was a special minig among Chasidei Karlin that on Chav Beis Tamuz, the Hilula of Rav Shlomo of Karlin, Hashem Yikim Domei, there was a special simcha, despite it being B'mei Bein Hametzarim, and they would make a Shehechiyanu on a Pri or a Malbash Chadash deliberately. And he cites in a footnote Moedim L'Simcha, which I believe is Tuvia Freund, if I'm not mistaken. I actually have this set at home, which I also obtained in the manner that I obtained the set of Chazay Ovadia. And so Moedim L'Simcha mentions this, and he quotes from a sefer Shema Shloimei. I didn't look it up. I'm guessing it's a Chassidish sefer, perhaps Maisis, on the Shlomo Karlin, just a guess. He writes that the Rabbi Tzadok HaKadosh of Asher Kolel Taka, perhaps is the one who started the minig of saying Shehechiyanu Chav Beis Tamuz, the Ilula of his holy Rebbe Shlomo of Karlin. For those not familiar with the dynasty, with the lineage, I believe that the dynasty continues from Rabbi Aaron of Karlin. Rabbi Aaron of Karlin and Rabbi Shlomo of Karlin were colleagues. Rabbi Aaron was the first tzaddik of Karlin. He might have even passed away B'chai Hamagid. Then was Rabbi Shlomo of Karlin, who perhaps could be said to have founded the Tnu of Karlin. We know many maisos between him and the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Tanya, and their differences of opinion. And then when Rabbi Shlomo of Karlin passed away, was killed in Tovkuf Nun Beis or Nun Daled, somewhere around there. Then the leadership returned to the dynasty, to the lineage of Rabbi Aaron Karlin's descendants. So there you have Rabbi Asher of Stalin, and here he's referring to the Hilula of his Rebbe, Shlomo Karlin. And Rabbi Asher of Stalin said that this day doesn't count as part of the 3 weeks, and he said, B'zeh Lashon, Ani Yomer Zog, that you're even allowed to make a chasana on this day, just like you can make a chasana Lag BaOmer. The Hilula Rabba of Rashbi, the same is true for this day. Sort of applying the logic. If there's a musik of a hilula, a yard site of a tzaddik, as Lag BaOmer came to be understood, so he's going and applying it to his Rebbe, Shlomo of Karlin, and he says, if I knew the Welt would listen to me, I'd be matter. I see the Welt won't listen to me, but I know in my heart that it's mutter. So that's in Moedim L'Simcha B'Shem, the Sefer Shema Shloimei. And he cites as well that Rabbi Aaron of Karlin, the Beis Aaron, would say this, would recount this, would repeat this every year in Chav Beis Tamuz, and he would make a Shehechiyanu. And the Bechmiel Moshe of Koznitz would also relate this every Chav Beis Tamuz and make a Shehechiyanu. And so on in this vein. Of course, we could potentially go off on the whole topic of Shlomo of Karlin and the fact that he was killed. And it's definitely some information that's familiar, that's out there on it. I'm sure in Karlin there's much more. But even in Chabad it comes up a bit. There's the question within Chabad sources about the date of Shlomo Karlin's passing, and the Frierdiker Rebbe, things that he wrote, and the letter from the Rebbe that the Rebbe wrote. And one of the documents that we have is the Alter Rebbe, when he was arrested, he was asked about Karlin, and he mentioned that Shlomo Karlin has already been gone for a while, seemingly in line, in consonance with tradition, that Shlomo Karlin had been killed a number of years before. I believe in Karlin, they saw messianic overtones in that incident. They said that Shlomo Karlin was Mashiach ben Yosef, and that the Cossack that shot him, his name was Armilos, who's the anti-Mashiach. So there's a lot of interesting stuff, definitely on the topic. I'm just sharing informally from off the top of my head. If I sat and researched every single point that I wanted to make in passing, then this would take many more times the amount of time and effort. But it just seemed like a cute thing to mention, an interesting, very Hasidic minhag of fifing on the 3 weeks, as it were, and saying a Shehechiyanu and carving out, just like, again, like Bein is also carving out a day, it seems, out of Sfira, especially if you're noeg the menhagim agan Sfira. It's not like Bein is your last day. It's just an interruption. So they have theirs for the 3 weeks, and he mentions that Maidan L'Simcha says it doesn't seem like anybody ever condemned it. We don't find that anybody ever went on the record and said, what's Karlin doing? This is wrong. So it's just a curiosity that this is, I'm not even sure, it doesn't necessarily document what the minhag in Karlin is ad hayoim. I didn't go and check and consult as to whether every Karlin Chassid, stolen Chassid, goes and is makbid to make a Shehechiyanu or not, or how they prav the day. Again, just relaying what I see here. Another cute point towards the end of the chapter is regarding Megillas Eicha. He says, the minhag b'nei Ashkenaz, the minhag of reading Megillas Eicha on Tisha B'Av from Klav, and you make a bracha, the Birchas HaMegillah. So usually when you make a Birchas HaMegillah, you also make a Shehechiyanu, just like everyone does for Megillas Esther. You make the bracha, you make a Shehechiyanu. So imagine making a Shehechiyanu as you're sitting on your overturned crate on the night of Tisha B'Av, and you're about to lay in Megillas Esther. He says, no. Ein mevarchen Shehechiyanu al kriyas Megillas Eicha mishum shehi al Puranos. Footnote, Kein Kosav HaGoyin Reb Chaim Kanievsky, then Shlita B'shut Nachal Eson. And with that, we conclude this discussion of another Inyan in Hilchos Bein Hametzarim, or Minhagei Bein Hametzarim, that I would like to discuss perhaps for the next installment. I would be glad, very happy to hear your feedback, both on the format, returning to recording and sharing, and also specifically on the specific issue, like I said, what other seforim say, what other Rabbanim paskin. If there's any important key information that was overlooked in this presentation, I would be very happy to hear it. I would be glad to hear from you. If you have my number, you can send me a message. If you don't have my number, then I guess you have to get my number. And let us conclude in consonance with the theme that the Rebbe would always return to, that Yehafchu, Yamim Elu, L'sasin or L'simcha, may these days be transformed for joy. Surely based on the pasuk in Zechariah about the 4 tzaimis, that Yiyeh lebeis Yehuda, l'sasin l'simcha, u'lamayadem tovim, may we indeed merit to see this speedily in our days. Ahisaf alachar zman, in this case, literally just a few minutes after I concluded recording the piece above, and of course, knowing that, the Rabbi used to add Ahisaf alachar zman to inyanim that he was Eicha in many other Gedolim throughout the Doros. We know the Beis Yosef wrote the Bayis Chadash, etc., etc. So better to follow up immediately rather than wait for people to respond. But one marker I really should have acknowledged and mentioned is the Piskei Teshuvos. Piskei Teshuvos is definitely one of the first seforim one should or one would probably consult when you want to see, especially when if you say to Shulchan Aruch, you want to see how the halachos of Shulchan Aruch are, how they translate into today's reality, today's halacha. So the Piskei Teshuvos addresses really both points, the question of Shehechiyanu on clothing in general, and specifically this question of whether that would impact the halacha of the 3 weeks. And this is what he writes. This is how he writes it. This is in Piskei Teshuvos Chelik Vav for Siman Tov Kuf Nun Aleph. He writes, "Ubizmanenu sherabim noegim she'en mevorchin klal Shehechiyanu al begodim chadashim mutter midina liknois ulchadesh kol habegodim ad rish chodesh av." And in the footnote, the way he puts it is, if you see from the Mishnah Brura, who, when it came to the question of what about Shabbos, the Mishnah Brura took the stance that you could wear beged chadash on Shabbos. So there you see the Mishnah Brura is going to the end with the gang that it's literally just a problem of Shehechiyanu, and it's hard to justify why there would be a problem saying Shehechiyanu on Shabbos. So it's the problem just of Shehechiyanu. So the second you eliminate the Shehechiyanu, you're good. So mutter midina liknos ulachadish. That's how the Piskei Teshuvos words it. And he writes, "Amnam yesh hakaisvim lahachmir bebgadim hayikarim hachashuvim kegoin chalifos v'chadayma she'af afi aminig she'em avarchin Shehechiyanu mikom makom ein lachadsham ba'afle b'shabbosus shebeshloishes hashavuos." And for that, he's metzayin to first of all to his own sefer on Sfira, where there's a similar discussion. And he wants to prove that we see from a number of places that there's also the hana of the beged chadash itself, and it's not just Shehechiyanu. And that's for Sfiras, Akolshkin, Inyam, and Hametzarim. I'm not going to look into that whole thing, just focusing here on the Sefer Chida and the Mechaber, etc. But what's his raya legabe Bein Hametzarim? El Yerabba, he says El Yerabba, when he was taking a stance on whether you could wear the beged chadash on Shabbos, El Yerabba said, no, even on Shabbos, what's the Shehechiyanu problem? So he quotes El Yerabba saying, "Beged ika simcha tfei." This is just something about a beged. And it's cited in Chai Adam, and in Das Torah, and quotes the Aruch Shulchan, which I had seen in the process of preparing this. I didn't get around to quoting it. The Aruch Shulchan says, "V'lachem b'Shabbos shema v'archen Shehechiyanu mutter lubish amnu manachnu." So the Aruch Shulchan actually words it as that's the minig. The minig is to avoid whether or not you could make a Shehechiyanu or not. And he brings another ayah, I'm not going to get into that. So that's how he phrases it in the Pnim, that Yesh HaKoisrim Lahachmir, based on the El Yerabba cited by the Chai Adam and the Aruch Shulchan. So on the one hand, and why am I being medayik in his lashon? Because I think he is sort of representative of the state of halacha today. On the one hand, he does go and say mutter midina, which is a whole new world, entire new wording that we hadn't had in the last few hundred years, mutter midina. But on the other hand, yesh hakaisem lahachmer, and obviously your takeaway when you read the passage is that we should probably just keep to that. Now for the minig, she'em avarchin Shehechiyanu, he sends you to what he says in Siman Reish Chav Gimel. So that's in Chelik Beis. In Siman Reish Chav Gimel, Ois Vav. I'll start with his first paragraph, even though it's not directly relevant, but the question is, what about all the other kelim, utensils, appliances? You should be making brachas on those as well. That, it almost seems like there's no havamina b'chlal to make a bracha, halacha l'maisa. So the way he frames it is, maskanas halacha v'haminig, le'inyin kelim beisiim v'chadayim, appliances, ein noeg in levarech hatoy v'hametu v'shehechiyanu. And even if it's very expensive, like a new car, or an air conditioner, or other electronic appliances, or furniture, or silver and gold, you don't see anyone doing it. For something that the family will enjoy. So interestingly, he does frame it and phrase it as, you still could. Wouldn't be wrong, wouldn't be bad, you wouldn't frown on it if you want to act on it and express your excitement in this halachic way and say those brachas, that's fine. But it's got to be something big and major and expensive, and you should be feeling the simchas halev. Then he mentions a hatzah from the Bein Ish Chai that you could be mechaven in birchas hatoiva hametiv in birchas hamazon, or say a Shehechiyanu on a pri chadash. So that idea of tziruf. All right, that was just interesting, so I mentioned it. Ba'al begadim chadashim, ba'aynu begadim hachashuvim, kugoyin me'il, chalifa, koiva yakar, umuhudur, shal yemei sachol, shal shabbos, talis shal mitzvah. So he says, the way he phrases it is noigim rabim levarech Shehechiyanu. Many still say Shehechiyanu, so he's not willing to give up and say that no one makes Shehechiyanu. And in the footnote, he justifies it by saying that, one of the Mekaydas not to say Shehechiyanu on utensils and appliances, say the Berchas Hanan of the Rav, the Alter Rebbe. where the Alter Rebbe says, "Kli tashmish yadam fil kli kasav azav ein noigen levarach klal loy b'kniyasam loy b'tashmishim b'chein iker." So the Alter Rebbe already had weighed in back then about how that's not the minig and b'chein iker, and yet the Alter Rebbe himself is still pro. It says the minig is to say Shehechiyanu on begadim chadashim. The Alter Rebbe doesn't indicate that there was any minig that affected that related to that. So the snapshot in time, 250 years ago, people were not saying Shehechiyanu for other things. They were still saying Shehechiyanu for Kalim, for begadim, and I suppose Pedus. So that's how he justifies Noigim Rabim Levorach Shehechiyanu. And then he adds, V'gam zeh metzinu menhagim she'em mevorach klal Shehechiyanu al begadim chadashim. The footnote he's been signed to the Magen Avraham about the Ashir. Quotes the Shut Marshag, which I also saw cited in the Sefer Shehechiyanu. The Marshag said he never said a Shehechiyanu on a Beged Chadash. There in Sefer Shehechiyanu, he also quotes another Makar that in the Sefer Das Naita from the Talmid of Chaim Kanievsky, he says he saw in the Kisver of Chaim Kanievsky that many years ago he asked the Chazon Ish that they bought a new Beged for Yom Tif and he doesn't feel Simcha, so should he say a Shehechiyanu? And the Chazon Ish said, "Das is a sheker. You do have Simcha." Then in the end, the Chazon Ish told him that the Maisa he should have kavana during the Kiddush of Yom Tov, Hametzarim of the two things, and it's also cited in the Sefer Maisa Ish. So that's a Maisele from that Winkele, Chazon Ish and Chaim Kanievsky. And we're back to the Piskei Teshuvos. He's been signed to Derech Chaim V'Shalom. That the Munkatcher said, or it's reported that the Munkatcher would only say Shehechiyanu for a Shabbos Dika Malbush, not weekday Malbushim at all, unless it was a Talis Shal Mitzvah. Then the Piskei Teshuvos adds, and how much more so today? Back then, they used to wear out their Oiber Beged, and then they would flip it inside out, and they would wear it a few more years, and the new Beged was a big simcha, and today you don't order it from the tailor, and you just walk into the store and take it off the rack, and you do it often enough, and there's no chiddush, and there's no simcha. So he's fully acknowledging the change in reality, even since then. And it's, of course, interesting to track the changes and note the trends in halachic discussion. Even in the previous discussion, it's interesting how that question about achilas pri, l'loy Shehechiyanu bein Hametzarim, seems to have exploded in that particular circle in the mid-1700s. Ovadia Yosef, Bein, Chaim, Chida, they're all, I think even the Maimon Mordechai belongs to that time and that circle. So it's just interesting how certain developments burst onto the scene. So the Alter Rebbe already says no Shehechiyanu for Kalim, but yes for Begadim. And then you see the Shmarshag and Munkatcher already 100 years ago saying maybe not. And then you have the changes that are still transpiring in the last 50, 75 years where our relationship with clothing is still changing. But at any rate, back to the question at hand. The Piskei Teshuvos' presentation, which I've seen replicated and cited elsewhere as well, like the Piskei Teshuvos obviously is very influential. Sometimes people complain that the Piskei Teshuvos doesn't actually deserve to be this influential, but whatever the case may be, as I said before, you don't have to see him as the authority and the source. Perhaps he's sort of just a representation, a mirror of where things stand. But of course, the Sefer is influential as well and shapes further discussion. So the Piskei Teshuvos had presented it, had phrased it as Mutter Midina Amram Yesh HaKaisum Lahachmir, and he's Mitzayin to the El Yerabba. So I figured we're not supposed to trust everything a Malak says. Let's look in the El Yerabba. If you look in the El Yerabba is actually earlier in the Siman and the Lavush. The El Yerabba, of course, and the Makarios we're about to discuss are on the Lavush. The El Yerabba is actually earlier in the Sif that deals with the 9 days. There he's mitzayin to his El Yezuta on the Sif concerning the 3 weeks. If you look in the El Yezuta, Lavush had said, Yesh Omrim, Sheyesh Li Zar, Melavarach Shehechiyanu bein Hametzarim al Pri Chadash, Oy al Malbush, Davar Sheyochel Litchoise Ad Achar Tisha B'Av. So the El Yezuta said, Ulefiza Ein Liknes Gamkein, Kelim Chadashim, Oy Lil Boish, She'ef Shelavarach Shehechiyanu Kol bein Hametzarim, Bach. Right, so that addition where the Bach says, okay, so if you can't make the bracha, so I guess that means you can't buy them. You can't buy the kelim, you can't wear the kelim, because you can't make the Shehechiyanu. V'chein kasav b'Shulchan Aruch Mahari Luria, Shulchan Aruch Arizal, as we already saw. Throughout Kisvei Arizal, we see this very strong lashon from Chaim Vital from the Arizal, and all the halachos of the Arizal had been malukat in the Shulchan Aruch Arizal already a few hundred years ago, because there was a lot of demand to know the Arizal's heiros halacha l'maisa. So v'chein kasav b'Shulchan Aruch Mahari Luria, v'afilu b'Rosh Chodesh v'Shabbosos kasav malbushei yomtiv de'aser the b'malbush ika simcha tvei. So this is what the Piskei Teshuvos is building on, that the Rabbi said that even on Shabbos, in the context here is we're talking about the 3 weeks, that would still be a problem. What's the problem? B'malbush ika simcha tvei. Okay, so that's what the Rabbi said. Makes my, actually the Yuzuta, and again the Rabbi is mitzayanted earlier, makes my case a little harder. But if you actually take a look at the Malbusha Yomtiv, which is hopefully printed on the same page, the Malbusha Yomtiv is stellen sich on the next line in the Levush. The Levush says, "V'nidali, the b'Shabbos shebin sayim muter levarich Shehechiyanu al pri chadash." He's only referencing the pri chadash. So Zok Malbusha Yomtiv v'mkein hachinami malbush chadash dila'el sif ches delevish masha yirtza. Now yesh lachalek the Malbushim ika simcha tvei keda ashkachon b'Shabbos shel chazayin. So, yeah, it sounds like that's what the Malbush Yomtiv is saying, but if you pay attention, seemingly, to the Malbush Yomtiv, the Malbush Yomtiv said, Malbush Chodesh Dila'el Sifches. Dila'el Sifches is referring to the 9 days. So, earlier in that Sif in the 9 days, the Levush didn't address what about Shabbos of the 9 days. The Levush mentioned Shabbos, Shabin Sayim here with regards to the 3 weeks. The Malbush Yomtiv wants to know, what about the Malbush Chodesh Dila'el Sifches of the 9 days? Can you wear Malbush Chodesh on the Shabbos of the 9 days? And it's possible for there to be 2. This could be the first one, and then the second one, Shabbos Chazayin. And the Malbush Yomtiv says, "Yesh lachalek the Malbushim ika simcha tvei keda ashkachon b'Shabbos shel Chazayin." When it comes to Shabbos Chazayin, the Ashkenazim had a minute to be very stark machmer in Shabbos Chazayin as well. But the context here is Malbush Chodesh Dila'el Sifches, and he's also comparing it to Shabbos Shel Chazayin, which is the same din of what you can or can't do during the 9 days. And he's saying, with regards to the question of the 9 days and the Shabbos of the 9 days, that there's an issue. The Malbushim Ika Simcha Tvei. Now, if you look earlier in Sifches, the lashon Levush was avalul b'shbegadim chadashim afilu min olam chadashim nagu isim eresh chodesh shunami b'chlal miyut simcha mishenichnas av b'matin b'simcha v'afilu l'knoison yesh behem simcha v'aser. So here, when it comes to the actual iser begadim, as we distinguished, made the distinction earlier at the beginning, that's the difference. That during the 9 days, it's the problem with the begadim themselves. It's a problem with simcha mishenichnas av b'matin b'simcha, and that's mishenichnas av. We say from Rosh Chodesh of the 9 days, not the 3 weeks. Doesn't say Mishenichnasu the 3 weeks. So the context there specifically relates to Simcha. The Malbush Yomtiv here is connecting between the discussion of Simcha there and the point from Shabbos here. And in that context, the Malbush Yomtiv seems to be saying, Yesh lachalek the Malbushim ika Simcha tvei. And again, without looking up the pratim of Shabbos Chazayin, but this is idea that Shabbos Chazayin, I guess when it comes to food, we eat basar v'yayin, but there was still this minhag to be machmir more on Malbushim on Shabbos Chazayin. So Bazoi, if that was there was even a minhag to wear big day choil, etc. So that context, it seems that when it comes to din Malbush, din Simcha, we treat Malbushim more stringently even than basar v'yayin when the issue is an issue of Simcha. That is how I would understand the Malbush Yomtiv. And the Bazoi, it's taka very geschmack and not shver. And he's not introducing a whole new hafchis-dik, kapir-dik take on the Isser of Shehechiyanu during the 3 weeks. What about the Eliezuta? The Eliezuta, so it looks a bit like a shtickle broken telephone. And one could argue that Seif Kol Seif, the Arizal, had already Taka said that it's also even on Shabbos and Yom Tov, although curiously he doesn't seem to attribute that to the Arizal. I didn't check the Shulchan Arizal carefully to see whether the point about Shabbos is mentioned or not. But we know Taka from Kisvei Arizal that the Arizal includes, I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier, but the Arizal says this applies even on Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh of Rosh Chodesh. So the concept of extending it to Shabbos exists. Why would you extend it to Shabbos? The Pashtus, you could extend it to Shabbos and say that even though Mitzat Shabbos, it covers up some of the halachos, but at the end of the day, the whole vart of not saying Shehechiyanu was a shtickle hergish, as we might call it in Chabad, a hergish of the Chasidim HaRishonim, and they didn't feel like this was the appropriate time to be doing this. So it's not really a din, it's a feeling, and that feeling might extend to Shabbos as well. Or maybe the Arizal has some cheshbon al pi Kabbalah that Shehechiyanu shouldn't be said, or whatever. But that doesn't suggest that we're introducing a whole new dimension and a whole new hagdara that the Mamalbush Ika Simcha Tvei. So El Yuzuta, to extend it to Shabbos, that's fine. But to quote Malbush Yom Tov as saying that, the way that El Yuzuta is quoting it seems to be in the context of the 3 weeks. To say that the Malbush Yom Tov said that it's Aser and Shabbos, the Mamalbush Ika Simcha Tvei, seems to be perhaps a misrepresentation of what the Malbush Yom Tov's actual kavana was. And this is not such a big deal. This happens in seforim, this happens in Halacha. You can often see how there's a break between the makar and the source, and I think even the Ramah and the Magen Avram and the Gedolei HaPoskim, you'll find instances where, okay, I guess this great posik added a new kvetch, added a new twist that wasn't really there in the makar that preceded it. That's okay. But in this case, as we get more recent in terms of the Paiskim and also there's different levels of seniority, Malbush Yom Tov, Tosfos Yom Tov is obviously earlier, of greater stature. El Yazut, El Yerabah, very, very chashav, from the Neisa Kalim on the Levush, but I don't know if it's on the same level as the Magen Avram and the Taz. I don't know if every vart, every line in El Yazut and El Yerabah is automatically mechayev in the same way. So in a case where he throws in, there's a dimension of simcha, which in turn isn't even seemingly based on the makar that he's taking it from, but rather adding a new twist. And in a case where that line of reasoning wasn't majorly influential and isn't cited by all poskim who followed after him, so I don't think that we need to be building castles based on this one throwaway line in the El Yazuta. Now, the Piskei Teshuvos claimed that the Chai Adam follows in the footsteps of the El Yerabah, El Yazuta, and he implies that he cites the El Yerabah. But I looked up the Chai Adam, and this is, I guess, one of the examples as to why you can't trust Malaktim. Up until now, I guess the El Yerabah seems to have said what he said. That's true. But the Chai Adam, as far as I can tell, the Chai Adam, Klal Kuf Lamed Gimel, Hilchos Tisha B'Av, Sif Yudaled, and he says, Medina Asal Bish Begadim Chadashim in Tzvum in Levanim Mishal Tzvum in Shal Pishta Meshabah Zeh. He's using the Lashon of the Mechaber. And we're referring here to the 9 days. So, specifically going to Mechaber, we're referring to the week of Tisha B'Av. And yeah, to mitzad ha-minig, the way he phrases it is our minig, Ashkenazim. It's not just the Shabbos, the week of Tisha B'Av, but Rosh Chodesh. And he adds, v'hainu afilu b'Shabbos after noig and levarich Shehechiyanu b'Shabbos. But that's all he says. He doesn't say why. And he's talking about the 9 days. So the Piskei Teshuvos seems to have built this yesod that there's another mahalach in Achronim, the mahalach of Simcha. And it applies, specifically the Chiddush, that it applies to the 3 weeks. When we see no such thing. There's that line in the El Yazuta. And but you look in the Chai Adam is talking about, he's talking about 9 days. And all he just says is, after Noig Levarich Shehechiyanu b'Shabbos, and that can fit nicely with the Malbush Yom Tov. That's an inyan of Simcha, which is the problem during the 9 days. As for the Das Torah, which the Piskei Teshuvos was mitzayin to, so yes, the Das Torah does cite it, so he sandwiched it a bit. So the Das Torah mentions the issue of Shabbos, the Kisvei Asar Afilu b'Shabbos, the Ayin Be'el Yerabah, that L'Kuli Alma would be a problem because the Bebeget Ika Simcha Tvei, but the Das Torah also continues, Aval Me'ah Magen Avram Muchach Lehipuch. Magen Avram in that Sif Cotton was expressly saying the opposite, that you see that in the 3 weeks it's a din in Shehechiyanu, and during the 9 days it's a din in Simcha. And in fact, the Magen Avram there said, so I'd already mentioned one afkamina earlier that he mentions, which is that if you already bought a beged betukah and you made a Shehechiyanu before the 3 weeks, so then because the problem is just the berachas Shehechiyanu, so that means you could wear the new beged during the 3 weeks, which grada is also useful to remember. There's a beferish Magen Avram saying that you can wear new clothing during the 3 weeks that you never wore before, as long as you made the Shehechiyanu already. So that's also relevant to this more general discussion. But that was one afkamina. But the previous afkamina he said is that Shabbos of the 3 weeks, you could. Shabbos of the 9 days, you can't, because during the 9 days, it's still b'shnichnas of matim b'simcha, masha'enkin, during the 3 weeks, it's a din of Shehechiyanu. So it's a beferish Magen Avram. The Eliyah Rabbi was actually acknowledging the Magen Avram and saying, no, I disagree, because there's still simcha, which, as we explained, is not really a thing during the 3 weeks. The Eliyah Rabbi seems to be the only one to be saying this, and it's not a shita, it's not a guy, not a mahalach in the chreinim, the way the Piskei Teshuvos is representing it. And the way the Das Torah puts it is he puts on the one hand the Eliyah Rabbi, on the other hand the but the Magen Avram didn't say that. So if anything, it sounds like the Das Torah is leaning more towards the Magen Avram, and you just mentioned the Eliyah Rabbi for the sake of it, but that's not what the Magen Avram said. And in fact, in the new edition of the Lavush from Zichron Aaron, on that Eliyah Rabbi earlier, their Metzayin on the bottom, and the Sharat Tzion, he said, "Any idea tam Eliyah Rabbi the Begamar leniency kiyim b'shnichnas av matim b'simcha v'lekedem." So if anything, the Achreinim are piling on to the Eliyah Rabbi and saying, "We're not sure what he means. We're not sure what's happening here." So the Eliyah Rabbi alone, seemingly, somehow arrived at this idea, arrived at this conclusion. It's a milsa de tmiyah. I demonstrated, it doesn't even seem to be what the Makar is saying. The Chai Adam does not repeat it. The Das Torah mentions it, doesn't seem to be siding with it. So the Piskei Teshuvos' attempt to say that this is Mahaf, this is Gan, this is Shita and Achreinim, and so therefore Yesh. So by Piskei Teshuvos' own logic, if that whole thing collapses, so we're bleiben, according to the Piskei Teshuvos, that it's mutter midina without a Shehechiyanu to be loivish in the 3 weeks, and like I said, it's almost beferish in the Magen Avram in his way of saying it. And there's this one Eliyah Rabbi. I don't think most people would say that we're all beholden to that day. You want to say that you want to be chayshish to Eliyah Rabbi? I guess you could say that, but it's a lot harder to just represent it as another major shita in this tchum. By the way, if you look in the Mishnah Brura earlier in the Simon mentions that in the Pnim and Sifkat Memhei, Ladasa Makilin the Bishabasa Shabin Hametzarim Mutal Avrach Shehechiyanu came Mutal Lil Bish Chadashim Bishabasa Shabin Hametzarim, and in the footnote he says, I got this in the Magen Avram, often the Magen Avram, Ayad El Yiraba B'Shem Moshe Yomtiv B'Tzad LaAchmir. He says, Ochen Achai Adam Hetek Kedas HaMagen Avram. So not only does the Chai Adam not say what Piskei Teshuvos said he said, but the Mishnah Brura in Sharat Tzin states clearly that the Chai Adam had to Kedas HaMagen Avram. Where is this? Not in Sif Yudalid, but earlier. In Sif Ches, because the Chai Adam rearranges the simony, he puts Bein Hametzarim first and 9 days later. So he says, Gam Noig and Shem Avarchim Shehechiyanu B'Yom Halalu. Alachin Gam Kenein Lev Shem Beged Chadash. Tzarech Levarech Shehechiyanu. B'Shabbos yesh noigen heter levarech Shehechiyanu. So the Chai Adam actually stated clearly and explicitly when it comes to the 3 weeks, ichalt, that b'Shabbos yesh noigen at least levarech Shehechiyanu. That's how he states it. He doesn't state another opinion. By the way, there's a toss. I'm looking in the Mishnah Brura Maduras Ois V'Hadar where they have tziyunim within the tziyunim of Sharat Tzin, and when he says Ochen Chai Adam heter kedas HaMagen Avram, they're metzayin to Sif Yudalid. But it's not Sif Yudalid, it's Sif Ches. So people are getting the Chai Adam wrong left and right. Piskei Teshuvos in his way, the people adding tziyunim to the Sharat Tzin in their way. And then the Kupan in the Sharat Tzin continues and says, that I quoted earlier was cited on the Daf in the new Madur of the Lavush. At any rate, there's a bit of a mess here in this topic, but I think we can cut through and say that let's not confuse those that are talking about the 9 days, like the Malvusha Yomtiv, and the Chayadam, etc. And when it comes to the Shabbos of the 3 weeks, so the Magen Avraham says clearly that it's fine. The Arizal says, Takanat. The Arizal doesn't say the reason. I would say Pashtus the reason is because in that sense of that hergish of the Puranus, even Shabbos has Puranus. It's not about a heter or an isser. It's a feeling. That feeling applies on Shabbos as well. Shabbos isn't here to be matir you from Avelus or from Simcha. That's not the dynamic here. So that's how I would be masber that. You have one line in the Eliyah Rabbah that the Mishnah Berurah himself is saying, let's leave it at that. And again, maybe there's more information out there. Maybe there are more factors, more achrayim that need to be taken into consideration. But based on what we've seen so far, I would say that the Piskei Teshuvos' own case as to why there's still a case to be made for the Shabbos of the 3 weeks, and by extension, the idea that even if you don't make a Shehechiyanu at all in this day and age during the 3 weeks, is not really a case. And he made the case that it's mutter midina, and he made a very unconvincing case that there's another opinion, and there really isn't much to that. So by the Piskei Teshuvos' own admission, as it were, one could argue that there really isn't much of a case to be made, even in contemporary seforim that are acknowledging this factor, these new developments. Elamai, you have the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan Taka says that even though he doesn't see a way to explain why Shabbos would be a problem, but the minhag is we don't do it during the 3 weeks. So Adrabah, I would go further than the Piskei Teshuvos and say that l'chaladeis maybe the minhag is still a minhag. Don't schedule your purchases for the 3 weeks. I wouldn't even go and say mutter midina. Mutter midina, I don't know. There's a minhag. So I would put that perhaps in the pnim. Then I would add, however, based on all of the above and the fact that otherwise you would say that it's mutter midina, therefore in a case, like I said, in extenuating circumstances, specific situation that led a person who otherwise was not planning, was not intending to get the new begad during the 3 weeks, but somehow things just aligned themselves that the beged that he wants, that he needs, that he was planning on getting around this time, punkt ended up falling over the line into the 3 weeks. I would say that based on all that we've seen, there could be some basis to say, you know what, we'll make some leeway, and it's not affecting and changing the character of how we generally observe these 3 weeks according to these mekaydes and the minhag of how this is done. And with that, we've been at this for quite a while here. With that, hopefully we conclude, and I can more confidently perhaps say that I think this puts this issue to bed. The facts are clear, the issues at stake are clear, and I think we have the information that we need to be able to reach a clear and proper